Before Noah's flood, Genesis and the Book of Enoch describe an unprecedented corruption that altered the earth's fabric. The heavens fell to earth, and what emerged from that forbidden blend should never have existed. The scriptures mention it sparingly, almost fearfully, in verses that still divide scholars and spark intense debate today. The memory of that lost world survived the waters, returning transformed in the legends of distant peoples around the globe. Sailors from every coast shared a similar tale of a strange creature, despite never having crossed paths with one another. A woman rose from the water, her inhuman beauty and hypnotic voice luring men to their doom without mercy. Some depicted her with a fishtail, others with wings or as a serpent. Yet the essence of the tale remained unchanged. This is not just one people's legend, it's a story echoed worldwide in many forms across different cultures. People who never traded or sailed together, unaware of each other's existence, all shared this common narrative. They all, without agreement, sketched the same creature with identical features and a shared, terrifying power. When one person creates a monster, it's folklore. When the whole world does, it raises a profound question. The question that no scholar has been able to fully resolve is why so many different minds coincided on such a similar idea. There are two possible answers, and the second is the one we will follow today as far as the trail will lead us. The first suggests that it is an archetype, an image that the human mind fabricates by itself anywhere in the world. The second implies something unsettling, that all those peoples recalled, though distorted, the same actual event. And there exists a text older than almost all those cultures that could explain where that shared memory originated. A text that the New Testament cites without hesitation, attributed to none other than the great-grandfather of Noah himself. Tradition took it seriously for centuries before it was set aside and nearly forgotten much later in history. It describes something so against creation that, as the account goes, God had to wipe it from the earth entirely. And here lies the unsettling part. That same event appears in just 4 verses, hidden within the book of Genesis. Most readers pass over those verses without stopping, as if they were merely a bridge to the story of Noah and the flood. But they are not a bridge. They are a crack, a slightly open door to a world that existed before the great flood. And if that creature from the water truly existed, its origin does not lie in the sea, but in the very first pages of Genesis. To grasp what crossed that door, we must revisit the beginning to chapter 6 and explore what few emphasize. For what is hinted at there connects, thread by thread, to the water woman who terrified sailors all around the globe. At the end, the question won't be if the legend is real, but why we've never been able to forget it. Follow me, then, to the origin, for the journey begins long before the first ship ever sailed the sea. Open Genesis to chapter 6 and pause at its first verses before the ark and the rain make their appearance. There are only 4 lines, but they contain one of the densest and most debated assertions in all of Hebrew scripture. The text recounts that as men multiplied on the earth, many beautiful daughters were also born to them, and that the so-called sons of God, upon seeing them, took as wives any they chose from among those women. Then comes the phrase that divides scholars. In those days, giants were on the earth, raising many questions. And also afterward, when those sons of God united with the daughters of men, they bore children of their own. Those sons grew to be the mighty men of old, the men of renown, whose names were feared throughout their time. The word that the Hebrew uses for those giants is Nephilim, a term linked to the unsettling idea of the fallen ones. Each term in that passage carries weight. Sons of God, daughters of men, giants born of their union, men of renown. The question is direct, and no one answers it comfortably. Who were those sons of God who took human wives? There is a modern reading that prefers to see them as mere pious descendants, a line of righteous men, and nothing more. But that is not the oldest reading, nor the one held by those who were much closer to the origin of that text. Rabbi scholars before Christianity and early church fathers all agreed on one important point. For them, those sons of God were angelic beings who left their place on high and descended to the earth. It was not a fringe idea. It was the dominant interpretation in the early centuries of the Judeo-Christian tradition. And the New Testament seems to confirm this when the Book of Jude, in its 6th verse, describes the following to the reader: that there were angels who did not keep their proper domain, but left their own abode, and now await in chains of darkness. The text presents them not as symbols, but as beings who crossed a forbidden boundary. Genesis only gives the headline of that story, but another, much older book dares to tell the details of what happened. That book is named Enoch, the man of whom Genesis says that he walked with God and one day simply disappeared. It was cited by the New Testament itself, which indicates that for the early church, it was not just any filler text. And what it recounts about the years before the flood is of such concreteness that it surprises anyone who reads it today. 200 celestial beings, whom the text calls watchers, descended together upon the summit of Mount Hermon. Before descending, they sealed a mutual oath, a pact of rebellion that prevented any of them from backing out later. The pact included a curse. Whoever broke it would bear alone the punishment meant for all the other conspirators. They were led by a chief named Semyaza, who feared being singled out as the only one guilty of that collective rebellion. Some even associate the name of that mountain with the idea of an oath, in memory of the agreement made there. Once on earth, they took human women as wives, and from those unions was born something that the text fears to name. The children of the Watchers grew to an enormous size and possessed a strength that no natural creature could match. Enoch claims they first consumed all of humanity's creations, draining the earth's resources completely. And when there was nothing left to eat, they turned their hunger against the very men who had seen them born and grow. But the book does not stop there, for it also details what those watchers taught humanity in their time. Azazel taught men to forge swords, shields, and the first weapons of war that would lead to widespread destruction. He revealed to the women the secret of cosmetics and jewelry that could ignite desire in those who beheld them. Others transmitted sorcery, the power of roots, enchantments, and the reading of the stars in the sky above. The text warned that this knowledge should never be in human hands, as it only led to bloodshed and chaos. That pact was more than a romantic mistake. It opened a door to cursed knowledge that should have stayed hidden. Enoch recounts that the blood spilled by the giants cried out from the earth until it reached the very ears of heaven, and that 4 archangels brought that outcry before God, pleading for justice for a world that was bleeding down below. God heard the outcry, and his sentence on the Watchers and their offspring would lead to the coming flood. The world before the flood, in these pages, is not primitive or innocent, but a place saturated with unnatural power. A world where the line between the human, the angelic, and the bestial had blurred almost to the point of erasure. Genesis summarizes that disaster in a single devastating phrase, just before finally presenting us with the story of Noah. It states that God saw that the wickedness of man was great upon the face of all the earth that they inhabited, and that every intention of the thoughts of man's heart was only evil continually, without any respite or pause. The Hebrew word used offers no nuances. The corruption described is total, complete, and without exception. And it is right here that the question arises that almost no preacher dares to openly formulate from the pulpit. The watchers took wives, and those wives bore children. The text only speaks to us of the male children that were born. Giants, warriors, men of renown, creatures of terrible strength who filled the entire world with violence and chaos. If there were sons, logic suggests there were daughters too, yet the account hardly mentions them at all. Both Genesis and Enoch focus all their attention on the male Nephilim and leave the daughters in pure shadow. So, what became of the female Nephilim, the daughters of those fallen angels, and the women they took for themselves? Think about it coldly. If the father was a being from heaven and the mother human, what would the female offspring inherit? Though not as tall as their warrior brothers, they inherit beauty and a supernatural voice. Hold that question in your mind, for it links Genesis to the shores of the entire world. Faced with that deformed world, God made a decision that would shake the very foundations of his own creation. He would not send a local punishment or a temporary flood, but a deluge capable of completely covering the entire earth. One single man remained just, and one single lineage had not been touched by the mixture brought by the Watchers. Genesis states that Noah was perfect in his generations, and many scholars read that phrase in a very concrete way. It would reflect his moral virtue and his blood, still pure from the contamination of the Nephilim lineage. By divine order, Noah built the ark over many long years, while around him the world sank deeper into violence. The heavens granted that world a deadline, a last opportunity to change, which, however, no one wanted to take advantage of. When the hour arrived, the text says that the fountains of the deep were broken up and the windows of heaven were opened. It rained for 40 days and nights, and the waters rose to cover even the highest peaks of the entire earth. Everything that walked, crawled, or breathed upon the ground was erased, and the giants and Nephilim were swept away as well. Only 8 people survived inside the ark, and with them, all that humanity remembered of the past was saved. Or, at least, that seems to be the case, until one notices a crack in the very narrative that does not quite fit. If the flood annihilated the Nephilim, why does the Book of Numbers speak again of giants in Canaan centuries later? Moses' spies, upon exploring the Promised Land, returned terrified by men of truly colossal size and stature. And why, generations later, does the Bible present Goliath, another giant, challenging the army of young King David? The text seems to evade the answer, as if its authors knew it but preferred never to write it down completely. Enoch himself leaves a chilling hint. From the bodies of the dead giants, unclean and wandering spirits emerged. Spirits that, according to that book, would wander restlessly upon the earth until the day of final judgment. Something survived or was remembered so strongly that it crossed oceans and centuries without losing its essence. And that memory reappears, time and again, in the figure of the water woman who opened this story from the very beginning. Let us finally speak of the Sirens, but first we must erase the sweet image that modern cinema has etched in our minds. The original Siren was not a charming maiden with a shimmering tail. She was a lethal threat, disguised as pure beauty. We know her primarily from Homer's Odyssey, in the scene where Odysseus must cross the dangerous sea of the Sirens. He is warned that their song does not resemble any human music, that it is a sound capable of stealing the will entirely. Whoever hears it loses control of themselves and steers their ship toward the rocks, toward a death they themselves seek. Odysseus orders his men to plug their ears with wax, and commands that he be tied securely to the mast of his own ship. And even bound, even knowing what it was, the tale recounts that that song nearly drove him to utter madness. The siren didn't kill with hands or weapons. She used sound, a power that pierced directly through the ears. It is worth remembering that Homer does not write about weak sailors, but about warriors hardened in 1,000 battles. And even they could not resist that voice. Before it, they crumbled as if their courage had never existed before. Where does a culture derive such a precise image from pure fantasy, or from the echo of something that once was real? There is also a detail about the Greek sirens that almost no one knows, which makes this whole matter even stranger. In ancient Greek art, they depicted women with wings and claws, half bird and half beautiful, not fishtails. The fishtail came many centuries later. What never changed was their female sex and their voice used as a weapon. For that is the true core of the myth, not beauty itself, but the voice turned into a trap that conquers reason. It is the idea of a sound that subjugates the mind without touching the body, an invisible weapon that no armor can stop. And exactly that core reappears in every corner of the planet when one begins to search for creatures similar to them. In West Africa reigns Mami Wata, whose name literally means Mother of the Waters in the local tongue. She is described as an astonishing beauty, half woman and half fish or serpent, depending on the people who remember her. She possesses the power to captivate men, to drag them under the water, and to keep them in a realm that is not our own. Her cult is not a local rarity. It extends throughout West and Central Africa and into the diaspora of that continent. She traveled on slave ships and took root in the Caribbean and South America with the same strength she had in her origin. And if we go to Mesopotamia, the very land where Genesis places the first steps of humanity, we find even more. There existed the Apkallu, beings half man and half fish, wise messengers who came from a time before the flood. The historian Berosus in Babylon described Oannes, a figure with a fish body and a human face that emerged from the sea. That being, he said, came from the water to impart knowledge to men, a very uncomfortable echo of what Enoch recounts. For Enoch asserts just that: the Watchers taught humanity knowledge that should remain forever forbidden. And Babylon sculpted these beings into the walls of their temples centuries before Greece wrote about the Sirens. In Assyrian reliefs, priests appear covered with fish skins, disguised as hybrids between fish and man. Further north, the Slavic rusalki were water spirits in the form of women whose beauty was as cold as it was deadly. It was said that they dragged swimmers to the depths of rivers and that their laughter heralded the approach of death. In Japan, the Ningyo was a fish woman whose flesh, according to legend, granted immortality to whoever dared to eat it. In Ireland and Scotland, the Selkies would shed their sealskin to walk among men as beautiful women. In ancient Syria, they worshipped a Targatis, a goddess depicted with a woman's torso and a fishtail at the top of the temple. The Philistines revered Dagon, a marine deity whose name even appears in the pages of the Old Testament. And in India, there were talks of Apsaras and Naginis, female beings of the waters endowed with a lethal magnetism. In Northern Europe, The Nixie and the Undines seduced travelers by rivers, lakes, and solitary springs. Every continent, every sea, every ancient people ended up with the same supernatural feminine figure linked to water. What's astonishing is not just the abundance of sea monsters, but their similarities in form, sex, and type of power. A beautiful woman, an irresistible voice, a connection to water, and certain death for any man who dares to listen to her. No matter how the names change, the essential portrait remains identical from one end of the planet to the other. Stop and seriously ask yourself how peoples without any contact could coincide in such concrete and precise details. Not in the vague idea of a sea woman, but in her exact nature, in her weapon, and in her effect on human males. The statistics alone disturb dozens of cultures, a single mold, repeated with a fidelity that defies chance. Here enters the hypothesis that some scholars of ancient texts have proposed, and which deserves calm examination. We will not accept it blindly, but we will not dismiss it just because its content proves deeply uncomfortable to hear. We know from Genesis and from Enoch that certain celestial beings fathered children with women before the flood arrived. The Nephilim, tainted by their unnatural power, corrupted the human lineage and all living things around them. Enoch reveals a detail Genesis omits. Corruption spread beyond humanity to affect all forms of life. His chapter 7 asserts that the Nephilim also corrupted the beasts, the birds, the reptiles, and the fish. Those lines suggest a widespread mixing that affected the entire natural world, not just the direct offspring. Then came the flood and covered the earth, cleansing its surface of almost everything that had once inhabited it. But the water cannot drown what lives within it, and the flood never reached the ocean's deepest abysses. The obvious objection is that this is an ancient text and not a report that we can verify today with instruments. And it is a fair objection, but the cultural pattern surrounding it does not depend on anyone's faith to be observed. The legends are there, written and carved, and they demand an explanation as rigorous as any other human enigma. If the Nephilim populated the earth, could some form of those hybrids have taken refuge in the sea and survived underwater? It is at this point that the thread finally ties in with the old question we left open about the female Nephilim. Let us remember the pattern. Genesis and Enoch portray the male Nephilim as terrestrial warriors of great renown. But the legends from all over the planet place the beings of water, almost without exception, on the female side of the myth. Women of impossible beauty, voices of supernatural power, and an attraction that mortal man cannot deny. Just as the Watchers, male angels, were seduced by the daughters of men and descended to earth to take them. There could exist here an inverted reflection, the same dynamic, but now read from the female lineage of that bloodline. The fallen angels descended, attracted by human women, and left behind a truly monstrous offspring. And perhaps those daughters, heirs of that same unnatural blood, were in turn attracted by the sons of men, luring them, enchanting them, dragging them to the water and to death, just as their fathers had done before with the women. We must be honest. The Bible does not affirm this in any verse, whether with these words or others. There is no line in Scripture that states that the female Nephilim transformed into sirens within the sea. What is recorded is the account of a total corruption prior to the flood that reached all of living creation. And all we can do is follow that trail, cross-reference the sources, and ask ourselves what memory gave birth to them. And that memory, whatever its origin, always points in the same unexpected direction, towards water and the feminine. Because there is still one more piece of the puzzle, and this time it appears directly within the biblical text itself. In 2 passages of the book of Isaiah, there appears a Hebrew word that has puzzled translators for centuries. That word is Lilith, or in plural, Liliot, and each version of the Bible decides to translate it in a very different way. Some turn it into owl, others into a vague nocturnal creature, and some choose to leave it untranslated altogether. But the ancient Greek version, the Septuagint, translates it as Oannes, a hybrid creature of monstrous appearance. The passage depicts Edom's desolation after divine judgment, stating that creatures will inhabit its ruins. Those verses do not speak of ordinary fauna. They speak of presences that occupy the void left by God's punishment. Over time, Jewish tradition wove an entire narrative around Lilith, a female entity of very dangerous power. They placed her in desolate places and linked her to the night, to desire, and to a silent danger lurking in the dark. These are traits that resonate almost point by point with the female water creatures scattered across the entire world. It is not a single tradition that fears her, but an echo that reappears in cultures that have never heard of Isaiah. Another Hebrew word, tannin, appears in the Old Testament and is translated as dragon or sea monster. And this detail is key. The judgment of the flood swept the earth, but the sea remained entirely untouched by those waters. Chapter 41 of Job offers the most detailed portrait of a sea beast called Leviathan by name, a being invulnerable to any human weapon, exhaling fire and dwelling in the darkest depths of the entire ocean. God describes it to Job as a concrete and palpable reality, not as a mere poetic image or a blurry symbol. The text details its scales, its breadth, and its lair in the abyss with the coldness of someone describing a real witness. Scripture even names Rahab, another sea monster tied to chaos, whom God subdues with his sheer and enormous strength. A psalm speaks of the heads of Leviathan crushed in the waters, as if it were an old enemy already well known. For them, in some, the depths held real creatures, not metaphors meant to scare children into obedience. For the ancient reader, the sea was not a beautiful landscape, but the border with a submerged world full of threats. Those writers took such realities with a literal seriousness that today, almost always, we have completely lost. Now let us gather all the pieces, for when we arrange them, the silhouette that appears is unsettlingly coherent and clear. Before the flood, the Watchers descended to earth and fathered offspring with the daughters of men. That offspring, the Nephilim, corrupted humanity with their power and, according to Enoch, also the entire natural world. The corruption was absolute, and the divine response was a flood meant to wash the earth of what it had become. The symmetry chills the blood. If the male angels descended for women, the daughters could rise seeking men. The water engulfed the land, not the sea's bottom, and the memory of the past stayed safe with the 8 survivors. From those 8 descend all the peoples, and with them spread across the planet the same ancient memory. Each civilization kept it transformed into myth, preserving almost intact the essence of what they still remembered. Each people varnished the memory with their own culture, but beneath that varnish, the same ancient silhouette always beats. Tales of half-human beings linked to water, of supernatural beauty and voices that bent all human will. Too similar, too precise, and too universal to be the fruit of each people's isolated imagination. What distinguishes a myth from a memory is precision, and the precision of these stories does not admit an easy explanation. The most disturbing part is that it wasn't created by one author, but by thousands of voices across seas and ages. No single piece by itself proves anything, but all together draw a figure that is very difficult to look at directly. It is like a mosaic whose pieces, scattered across the world, fit into an image that no one wanted to fully compose. It is not necessary to believe in every detail to feel the weight of a coincidence that repeats across the wide planet. The lack of an explicit affirmation does not equate to a lack of evidence, and the gathered evidence is hard to dismiss. There remains one final piece, and it connects this story not just with its beginning, but with the very end of all things. The Apocalypse, the Bible's final book, reveals a little-known truth. In the new world, there will be no sea. Among all the promises of the end, the absence of death, pain, and tears slips in a strange phrase, "No more sea." Why include the disappearance of the sea among the great promises of a new heaven and a finally restored earth? John writes it while exiled on the island of Patmos, and that line about the sea intrigues theologians since then. For many, the sea in the Bible is not just water. It symbolizes primordial chaos and the dominion of the dark and the hidden. In the Hebrew mind, the sea guarded the untamed, what escaped the order, and the hand that had ordered creation. The abyss, the deep, the place where things dwell that God has not yet fully subjected to his final and definitive judgment. That is why a world without a sea sounds to ancient ears like one without abysses or shadows. A world where finally nothing remains hidden beneath the waters, waiting in silence for the right moment to resurface. If that is true, if the sea holds a spiritual meaning that dates back to the corruption prior to Noah's flood, then erasing it in the new creation would not be a mere change of geography, but the closing of a very ancient wound. The final seal of a door that had been open since the days of Noah, since the Watchers, since the ancient Nephilim. The Sirens, Mami Wata, the Rusalki, the Ningyo, and the spirits of 100 cultures, all finally sealed forever. And the sea, along with everything it hid in its depths, would finally cease to exist in any form or place. What God erased with the flood was not just a cursed generation, but a complete and deformed version of the world. A version so far from the original plan that it had to be scrapped and the story restarted from the beginning. And yet the memory of those beings did not die. It traveled from mouth to mouth, from people to people, from sea to open sea, told in 1,000 tongues by 1,000 peoples who never saw each other, and yet sketched the same identical creature. Beautiful, supernatural, feminine, born of the water and deadly to any man incapable of ever resisting her call. The deeper we explore the Nephilim, the wider the horizon, and the more questions emerge where we once had certainties. It is one of the densest enigmas in all of Scripture, and we have barely scratched the surface of what it still conceals. Each answer opens 3 new questions, and each ancient text seems to guard one more door behind the previous one. Perhaps they are nothing more than myths of human fear of the ocean, and that remains the simplest explanation of all. Or perhaps each of those voices, separated by centuries and oceans, described something that existed before the Great Flood. That choice is in your hands, but after following the trail to here, the question can no longer be easily ignored. If this story has made you look at Genesis with new eyes, subscribe, for there are still many more mysteries waiting for you.